Shalom Aleichem, welcome to Try by the Fire with Yoshi. This is part 2 of discovering the originality of the New Testament. If you haven't seen part 1, please go back and watch it. Let's get into it. So why has mainstream academia made such desperate attempts to prove Judea spoke Greek based on such flimsy evidence? The answer lies in the specific background of the scholars driving this narrative. When most people think of a scholar, they picture an individual driven by a pure, uncompromising endeavor to discover historical truth. We imagine an objective researcher following the raw data wherever it leads, completely detached from personal bias or institutional pressure. Unfortunately, that idealistic image is very different from reality. Academia is not a sterile sanctuary of pure science. It's a human institution governed by career preservation, traditional consensus, and financial security. When a professor's entire career, tenure, and reputation are built upon a centuries-old foundation, protecting that foundation becomes an act of self-preservation. True objectivity is often traded for institutional conformity. If the facts threaten to upend the traditional narrative, the system will naturally choose to manipulate the data rather than dismantle its own authority. This isn't conspiracy. It's just the practical way the institutional academics work. So who are these scholars who have aided in the current consensus concerning first century Judea and the New Testament? The overwhelming majority of the professors, text critics, and theologians who publish these studies are devout Western Christians and seminary professors. These scholars are trapped in a 500-year-old Eurocentric pipeline. Because Western universities, the Protestant Reformation, and all modern English Bible translations are built entirely on the printed Greek text, these institutions have a massive professional and theological conflict of interest. To admit that the Greek New Testament is actually a secondary translation of an Aramaic original would upend centuries of seminary training and traditional church authority. Furthermore, these academics are usually classical philologists. Their entire careers are dedicated to Greco-Roman history and Greek literature. Because they don't know how to read Semitic languages like Aramaic or Syriac, they naturally ignore the Eastern historical records and interpret the ancient world exclusively through a Western lens. The academic consensus that Judea spoke Greek is not an unbiased scientific conclusion. It's a self-protecting system of institutional tradition, career safety, and an active bias that completely refuses to look east. This raises a fundamental question. When is it time to stop accepting an institutional tradition and actually start looking at the evidence? If you find yourself instinctively defending the Greek text or assuming it must obviously be the original, it is worth pausing to evaluate that certainty. Is that conclusion backed by historical facts, or is it simply a protective reaction against having an inherited tradition challenged? When a paradigm is repeated for centuries, any alternative is labeled as wrong by default, creating a structural barrier against new information. If the assumption of a universal Greek original fails under historical and archaeological scrutiny, it leaves a massive gap in the history of the text. So, if the evidence does not support a Greco-Roman starting point, is there concrete, verifiable evidence pointing toward an Aramaic original? To find that evidence, the focus must shift entirely away from Western European academic circles and move directly to the Middle East, into the history of the Syriac Church of the East. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed and changed languages over the centuries, the Christians of the Persian Empire maintained an unbroken, continuous geographic and linguistic line back to the 1st century. For as long as their historical and liturgical records exist, the Church of the East has held a baseline tradition that the New Testament was natively written in Aramaic. Disclaimer, I am not doctrinally affiliated with the Church of the East. This is a historical analysis, not a doctrinal analysis. Let's continue. To the Church of the East, Aramaic primacy is not a modern academic theory. It's their unbroken historical identity. They have continuously used the Aramaic text, known as the Peshitta, in their worship service since the Apostolic era. The word Peshitta literally means the straight or simple text. But what about Paul's letters that he specifically wrote to places within the Roman Empire, like Corinth or Rome itself? To truly understand how letters written to cities like Rome or Corinth ended up at the core of the Aramaic New Testament, we have to look at the first century historical model maintained by the Church of the East. The mainstream Western narrative assumes that Paul penned his letters natively in Greek and sent them straight to Europe, leaving no physical trace behind in Judea. But the Eastern historical record reveals a completely different chain of custody. First, we have to remember the actual demographic reality of the first century Roman Empire. Large communities of the Jewish diaspora were already firmly established in all of these European regions. According to the historical record, when Paul arrived in these cities to evangelize, his systematic rule was to go directly to the local synagogues. This means his letters were not addressed to random pagan Gentiles. They were written to the existing synagogue communities, which were heavily composed of Jews and God-fearing converts. Even though these communities used Greek for daily business in the Roman Empire, their sacred administrative and liturgical language remained Aramaic. Because of this Semitic foundation, Paul penned his epistles natively in his own spoken language, Aramaic. From there, the letters would have been sent to the intended synagogue. Once it arrived, the local leadership in a city like Corinth, who natively understood the language, would then translate the Aramaic text into Greek for the Greek-speaking participants who had converted. And since the Eastern records show that even Paul's Aramaic letters arrived in Mesopotamia from Jerusalem, we can reasonably speculate that the Aramaic copy was then sent back to Jerusalem from the diaspora synagogue to be archived, thus resulting in a master Aramaic record of the text deposited and maintained directly within the city archives in Jerusalem. The historical handoff to the east occurred between 70 AD and 132 AD, a critical window bracketed by the destruction of the temple by Roman legions and the later Bar Kokhba revolt. As Roman persecution intensified and Judea faced total collapse, the leaders of the Jerusalem assembly had to secure the master library. The founding apostles of the Church of the East, including Judah, Thomas, Thaddeus, and Marie, were dispatched directly from that Jerusalem hub to plant the faith beyond the Euphrates River. When they migrated east into the Parthian and Persian empires to establish the church in Edessa, they physically carried the master Aramaic archives out of the war zone of Judea and brought them safely into the East. This explains why the Church of the East possesses these specific letters. They were never handed these texts by the Western Roman world. They were handed the original Judean records by the very apostles who rescued the Jerusalem library, preserving Paul's original native language copies outside the reach of Roman imperial destruction. When people first hear about the Aramaic Peshitta, they immediately point to the massive manuscript gap. They note that there are thousands of ancient Greek manuscripts dating back to the 3rd and 4th centuries, whereas the surviving Aramaic manuscripts do not reach that far back in time. This brings us to a major point of confusion in modern text criticism: the question of manuscript age versus true originality. The mainstream academic world often points out that the oldest surviving Greek manuscripts are older than the oldest surviving Aramaic manuscripts. Because of this, they automatically assume that the older Greek copies must represent the original source. But this assumption completely ignores the physical environment and the scribal traditions of the ancient East. In historical reality, the physical age of a surviving piece of parchment does not dictate the originality of the text written on it. To understand why the Aramaic copies we possess today are relatively recent, we have to look at the unique, meticulous preservation tradition of the Church of the East. The early Semitic scribes did not view their manuscripts as static museum artifacts to be locked away in a dry cave. They viewed them as living, active scriptures to be read and used daily in worship. Because they were constantly handling these texts in the damp, humid river valleys and mountain environments of Mesopotamia, the organic material naturally faced rapid decay. Knowing this, the Eastern scribes established a strict ceremonial duplication routine. Before a manuscript could wear down too much, and long before the ink smudged or faded to the point of illegibility, a scribe was canonically required to copy the text letter for letter onto a fresh piece of parchment. Once the brand new perfect copy was verified, the old, fraying manuscript was systematically retired and discarded. By destroying the old, smudged manuscripts before they became hard to read, the Eastern scribes completely eliminated the risk of future copyists misreading the letters and accidentally changing what the scriptures actually said. This stands in stark, dramatic contrast to the Greek manuscript tradition. When you look at the oldest surviving Greek codices, they are notoriously sloppy. They're filled with visual, text-critical nightmares. Large portions have been physically scratched out, words are visibly erased, margin notes have been accidentally bled into the main text, and whole verses have been later added by different hands. Because these decaying, damaged Greek manuscripts were kept and copied despite being barely legible, the scribes constantly misread the text. The result is that while Greek copies are abundant and physically old, they contradict each other constantly across thousands of manuscript variations. Indeed, the old Greek manuscripts were preserved illegibly for longer, and this is precisely what led to their abundance of copyist errors that the meticulous Semitic believers fought hard to keep at zero. Moreover, the reality of the Greek manuscripts is likely very different than what most people understand. Most people, when they hear that thousands of Greek manuscripts exist, naturally imagine an abundance of complete ancient Bibles safely preserved in libraries. In reality, the overwhelming majority of this vast collection consists of late medieval copies that are textual dead ends. These late texts are heavily flawed and cluttered with centuries of human error, intentional scribal expansions, and theological edits that gradually corrupted the original wording. This stands in sharp contrast to the famous 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, widely considered the most authoritative manuscript because it preserves the oldest complete New Testament text in existence. Yet, the ancient readings found in Sinaiticus only align with about 5% of the total manuscript pool. Furthermore, out of the roughly 130 early papyri discovered, only about 35 contain enough continuous text to be of any real value to textual critics, while the rest are merely tiny, unreadable scraps. When we face the historical data honestly, the illusion of thousands of authoritative witnesses vanishes. The actual number of ancient, meritorious Greek manuscripts that actually accurately preserve the earliest text stands at just about 35. The remaining thousands are simply late, derivative copies defined by obvious medieval alterations. While the Greek tradition crumbles under the weight of late medieval errors and fractured fragments, the Aramaic tradition offers a completely different story. When we apply the exact same honest standard to the Eastern tradition, the illusion of Greek superiority vanishes. The textual critics admit that we only have about 35 highly valuable early Greek manuscripts containing continuous text. Yet, when we turn to the Aramaic Peshitta, the numbers change dramatically. We possess over 65 pristine, independent Aramaic New Testament manuscripts that date directly back to the 5th and 6th centuries. That means the Aramaic tradition boasts nearly double the number of ancient authoritative witnesses found in the early Greek manuscript pool. The contrast goes far deeper than just the numbers, revealing itself in the physical condition and absolute unity of the text. If you line up those 35 early Greek witnesses, such as Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, they disagree with each other on thousands of words, spellings, and verses because they are plagued by regional variations. In sharp contrast, if you line up all 65 ancient Aramaic manuscripts, they match each other identically, word for word and letter for letter. The text remains perfectly unified across different centuries and separate geographical continents. Furthermore, while these early Greek witnesses are often reduced to fragile papyrus scraps or isolated books, these 65 Aramaic witnesses are substantial, continuous, and remarkably intact, having been beautifully preserved on durable vellum. This perfect preservation exists because Eastern scribes operated under a strict, sacred transmission system that treated the Aramaic text as an unalterable divine artifact. Unlike the unregulated Greek scribes writing in the early Roman Empire, Eastern monks counted every single letter, and even if a single mistake was made, the entire parchment was destroyed. When we stop counting late medieval copies and look only at the ancient meritorious witnesses, the Historica data proves that the Aramaic tradition is vastly more numerous, incredibly more intact, and flawlessly preserved. Therefore, just because the Greek text has older physical manuscripts surviving in the dry, arid climates of Egypt, it doesn't mean Greek is the original language. The older Greek copies simply reflect a messy text that was left sitting unused in a desert, while the newer Aramaic copies represent identical, flawless replicas of an unbroken chain of preservation, maintaining the original apostolic words down to the literal character spacing. A manuscript being older or newer is a matter of survival, which depends on preservation techniques. It has nothing to do with originality. Therefore, the age of a surviving manuscript cannot be used to determine if it's the original language of the original document. Thank you everyone for joining me for part 2. Part 3 will be coming soon, and we'll be talking about the textual evidence within the Greek and Aramaic New Testaments. Shalom!